everyone. I'm Tom Prendergast. I'm the New York Metro Executive for AECOM, but many of you know me as someone who's been in the infrastructure world in New York for 25 years with the MTA. It's an exciting panel we have today. It's talking about resiliency for infrastructure for the sustainable future. When I came to New York in 1982, hard to believe now, it's 42 years ago, Dick Ravitch had created the first capital program for the MTA, an $8 billion program that basically is equivalent to about $22 billion today. And it was to deal with state of good repair for the reliability of the system. It wasn't until 3 capital programs later that we started to talk about customer improvements to improve the experience, much like Rick Cotton has done at the airports at the Port Authority, a fantastic experience. Resiliency wasn't even in the vocabulary at that time in terms of what the system needed to do to protect itself from the changing climate. I'm not going to get into an argument as to whether or not climate change is actually occurring, because I think that's a diversion. I think it's a diversion from what needs to be done. Because one can't argue with the fact that the frequency and intensity of climate events is affecting our infrastructure. In December of 1993, we had a nor'easter come up the coast that was later determined to be a hurricane, and we lost 5 under-river tunnels due to flooding at New York City Transit. And then over the next few years, we had a number of more frequent and intense events. I wouldn't say culminating, because we've had them since then, but Superstorm Sandy, because it was not formally a hurricane, you saw what damage it did to the infrastructure of New York, especially the transportation infrastructure. So clearly it became evident that resiliency in terms of climate events needed to be part of agencies moving forward as they implemented capital improvements and state of good repair work. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that all 4 of these individuals have been involved in some way, shape, or form with that. We've got Rick Cotton, who's the Executive Director of the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey. We've got Adam Barsky, who's the Chief Financial Officer from the New York Power Authority. And many of you may not know all what they do and how long they've done it, but I think Adam can talk about that. We've got Jörg Kaltenegger, who is a hazardous materials investigator for the eastern region of the U.S. Department of Transportation, and Jason Vollen, who's the director of the iLab and Innovation Global Research for AECOM. And I'd like them to be able to walk through just a general introduction of themselves, talk about high points in terms of how they're focusing on that resiliency element going forward. And then when they get done, I'll ask them individually a number of different questions. So we'll start with Rick Cotton first, the Executive Director of the Port Authority in New York and New
Jersey. Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here. I see many familiar faces. I don't quite know how to start all the time in terms of talking about myself at the Port Authority. I regard myself as the accidental executive director at the Port Authority. For 25 years before I went to the Port Authority, I was a media lawyer at NBC Universal. But I wound up working for 2.5 years in the New York Governor's office on infrastructure projects, and then moved over to the Port Authority 6.5 years ago. So Port Authority has a 10-year capital plan that is close to $40 billion. Start to learn to deal with big numbers, but an enormous amount of that is directed toward state of good repair and now incorporating resiliency. So just very quickly, the Port Authority spent well north of $3 billion and is still spending on recovering from Superstorm Sandy. And so climate change is here. It is an existential crisis of our time. And the Port Authority has tried to embrace that. talk more later, but we've done two things. We just published a roadmap to net zero in terms of trying to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And we have totally committed ourselves to folding resiliency into really everything we've done.
Thank you. My name is Adam Barsky. I'm the CFO of the New York Power Authority. I've been here since 2019. I've spent at least 35 years in public and private service, both in banking and time in the governor's office for New York State, budget director for New York City, and had the pleasure of calling Rick Cotton my boss for a while as his chief of staff, and now I get the pleasure of calling him one of my biggest and most important customers. So glad that we partner on a lot of good, important projects together around resiliency. For us, it is an imperative. Not only are we responsible for generating 25% of New York State's electricity, but we are the owner of 40% of the high voltage transmission grid in New York State. And we are leading the transition to clean energy, primarily through building out that foundation in transmission to allow for energy to move throughout the state and unbottle congestion and bring in energy from offshore wind projects into Zone J, which is the New York metropolitan area, to where the heavily concentrated demand is, as well as other major projects. So we're in the middle of major infrastructure projects, in the tens of billions of dollars with partners. So not only is it important to make for the transition, but it has to be built with resiliency, building underground versus above ground, some of the things that will prevent that. But as far as state of good repair, which in any capital program is the first and foremost foundation that you must meet, one of the things that we've done for the first time ever is we did a long-term climate risk study in partnership with Argonne Laboratory and Columbia University to model out the effects of climate change over a very long period of time, and allowing that study to help inform our asset management plans. And we've begun to work that into our long-term plans as well. So it's very important for the New York Power Authority to maintain that integrity of the grid. So resiliency and state of good repair is the foremost for us.
So I'm Jason Volin. I lead the Innovation Laboratory globally for buildings and places at AECOM. What we do there is focus a great deal on high performance design at a range of scales, from the component scale, the building scale, and the city scale. We feel that infrastructure bridges all of those, that multiple asset types fits into that model. And a large part of what we do is work on the decarbonization of those assets in the early planning stages. We look at that from a perspective of what are the values and impacts of proper planning can be, from integrating in green and resilient strategies in terms of what are the avoided costs by doing it correctly the first time and planning in those types of things, but also looking to value underutilized parts of the infrastructure, such as excess sites for sequestration, or monetizing that value in some other way where we can begin to fund some of the important infrastructure components that we engage in as a city public. I think a great example, although not rail or transportation necessarily, is the Lower Manhattan Coastal Resiliency Project, where we have a public value for all of the days that we don't have a storm surge, and then we have a way to protect the lower Manhattan and provide a way to avoid cost in the future. It's a small example, and it does seem like a big project, but it's really small in comparison to the amount of water's edge, for example, that we have not tackled yet. So there's an enormous amount of work that we have yet to do in the New York metro area, where we can look at the value of our infrastructure and find other ways we can begin to use it, and value it, and perhaps monetize it to help prepare us for those storm events that we're seeing more frequently.
Hi, I'm Joel Kaltner, USDOT. I'm going to bring up some points that we see 12 months after the new construction. Some of the failures we see as it relates to compliance inspections, maintaining the new system you built, then obviously talk about some real-world lesson learned as far as failure points, and bring that up. Thank you.
I'm going to go around and ask some questions. Rick, we've heard a lot in the prior presentation and some other presentations about rail transportation, and certainly your agency has rail transportation. But you have aviation and you have ports and marine. And to a certain extent,
Not to mention bridges and tunnels.
bridges and tunnels, absolutely, yeah. And as a matter of fact, the tunnels are high exposure areas, so I apologize. I should remember it. But maybe I'm probably more unknowing in terms of the challenges you have in aviation, the challenge you have in ports and marine, in terms of what you have to do from a resiliency perspective as you make these improvements to airports and to the ports in the region.
Well, I'll start with the airports just because the Port Authority is driving literally $30 billion of investment across the three major airports. And resiliency plays a huge factor as one drives the really complete rebuilding of a facility, a transportation facility, specifically airports. But every single new building at the airports, LaGuardia, we tore down every single passenger facility with the exception of the landmark Marine Air Terminal and built new. And all of those new buildings had to meet our resiliency standards as well as the general building code requirements. And those resiliency requirements are intended to be not really as strict as we can justify. So every building site, every aspect of the operation, the electric supply, the passenger facilities, the maintenance facilities, all built with the notion that you had to protect against a certain level of sea level rise. You had to add to that virtually the highest reasonable surge you could imagine based on predictive storm patterns, but then an added safety range. And New York City requires, I've forgotten now whether it's 3 or 4 feet. We added a couple of extra feet, and we build every single and mandated the building of every single building based on that. So it does vary facility by facility. The path system are relatively small commuter railroad, but it has 4 tunnels that go under the Hudson. It has multiple stations in the floodplains, and it has been a massive job to rebuild all those and rebuild them to much higher resiliency standards. So there's the building initially. What we've also done in terms of our SGR program, which has a long history, agency deeply committed to it, what we have decided to do rather than create additional processes is to take a climate risk assessment, a resiliency analysis, however you want to express it. But that is being built into our regular SGR program so that when our facilities on a regular basis are inspected and analyzed, it is built in that there is a resiliency analysis with a real commitment of capital to assure that our facilities are moving up the scale of resiliency. It does vary facility by facility, but there just could not be a higher priority from the Port Authority's point of view than to take climate change into account.
Adam, from your perspective, a lot of people, I mean, I try to keep things simple. So, for the common person that, relies on water, electricity, sanitary, et cetera, people go to the wall and they flip up a switch and they expect the power to come on and they expect, their appliances and everything to work in the house. But, you're primarily responsible for generation, but you play a significant role assisting and providing financial assistance for transmission in the end user side. So from your perspective, where do you see the challenges in terms of resiliency in that power network and the grid, and ultimately getting power to the end user as soon as possible, protected from a storm, but then as soon as possible after if you lose it when the storm recedes?
That's a good question, Tom. Thanks. Yeah, so there's a number of things that we're doing. As I mentioned, one of the things we're taking an opportunity to do, we just were awarded a project in partnership with Transco, which is a conglomerate of some of the largest investor-owned utilities in the state. Together with them, we are doing a project called Propel, which is concentrated on Long Island. And this will enable offshore wind to make its way through Long Island into areas in the city, Westchester, North. But we are using that opportunity for that project to address the issues of resiliency, because if you know from Long Island and the storms that they've had and the issues that LIPA has faced over the years, a lot of it has to do with trees and overhead transmission. So by building out resiliency, by having underground transmission, we have an opportunity to prevent some of those failures that have happened in the past. Now the challenge is, we're going into neighborhoods of all different types and digging up streets and doing things of that nature, and that's never too popular. So certainly it's going to be a challenge, but as we've learned with our partners on the Port Authority, it requires lots of education and community engagement and understanding and providing opportunities to local businesses, local jobs, and the benefits that people will realize from these projects when they're completed will outweigh some of those challenges. So to me, that's one of the most important parts of trying to get some of these things done. Another good example is some of the work we're also doing with Rick and the Port Authority. We're about to break ground in the next few weeks on the solar project in JFK. That project will not only help provide power to JFK, it also will serve as as a means of redundancy. It'll have storage capabilities, which will also act as backup battery in times that there are failures, which is critical for the airports. But it will also provide community solar benefits for the local community. So additional revenues that are going to be generated from that project will go towards bill credits for local NYCHA residents in the area. So to me, this project is, it's 12 megawatts. It's one of the largest projects of solar in New York City to date, and something we're very proud of because it accomplishes all those goals I just spoke about.
Amen, Adam.
I'll go to George next. From a hazardous material perspective, I think probably the safest form of transportation is pipeline. And then you've got a lot of hazardous materials in the country moved by either rail freight or motor carrier freight. So from a resiliency standpoint, what are the challenges you're most concerned with from the hazardous materials perspective?
Unfortunately now, we're called also to structure fires now. So one thing I want to kind of emphasize is there's a lot of excitement on day one, but there are a lot of day two problems maintaining. So when we arrive at a new system with new subsystems, usually 12 months, 18 months, number one problem we usually see is the employee that is supposed to do the daily, weekly, or monthly upkeep was very competent in the old system, the old materials, the old shapes, the old energy systems. But this new material, they're not very competent. And what we're seeing then is when we trace back to a failure point is the system, the new subsystem for 6 months was communicating that it was under duress, whether it's structure or electrical, whatever it was, but no one was listening. So it's very important. I understand, I can tell by everybody's looking here that everybody here is a problem solver. So as soon as you get this project done, you move on to the next one. But please, if you can, double back 6 months, 12 months, because you can build the most perfect structure in subsystems, but if we're not maintaining it with the proper care, it's going to all degrade. So the biggest thing I think we see is the technology gap. Now we're transferring energy wireless. Every time we key on any system, it does a data call. Make sure someone is listening. One last thing I want to bring up, we had an incident about 12 months ago. It was an energy unit that used to be in buses, went to ships, now is inside a structure. It's a high density lithium battery unit. For 6 months, that unit was putting out warning alerts and error messages saying, I'm under duress, you're not maintaining me in a proper fashion, but no one was listening on the other end. So please, I know it's really tempting to move on to the next project. But if you can, circle back, make sure what you built previously is being maintained. Thank you.
Jason, if you could share with us from an innovation standpoint, any new tools that are out there in terms of helping design to make informed decisions. I think Rick had an example of, there's never enough dollars to do all that you need to do. And I can guarantee you when you run an agency that is a large asset, you always are down to your last dollar. Where do you spend that last dollar? And you try to make as informed a decision as possible. So from a standpoint of innovative tools to be able to be guided by the science and the numbers, could you give us some? And speaking to what George talked about, which was this issue of innovation in the way of ongoing inspection and maintenance, because once the asset is out there and once it starts to age, we say something's got 30 years life, and it's not exact. So you have to watch its past. But if you could give us some examples of innovation in the form of design, innovation in the form of inspection and maintenance.
I think one of the most important things is proper planning up front and to look at both qualitative and quantitative measures in the planning stage. So one of the things that we've been doing a lot from an infrastructure perspective, and we're doing this in multiple projects now across Asia, is a process we call AECOM 0. We have it at an infrastructure scale, and it rates measures that are both qualitative and quantitative. So for example, it could be speed to market or procurement aspects of that infrastructure, but also carbon sequestration, throughput from the transit side, and being able to look at all of those points together rather than separate those out into different disciplines or different departments allows us to be able to trade off what might be more effective rather than the most efficient. So this process is really multivariable trade-off optimization. It's not a new process, but it's something we're now trying to operationalize very early in the project. So we're looking at as many variables as we can early stage, knowing that we probably know more about any one of those individual projects from an engineering perspective at high detail on day one, but we don't get to it until day 3 from a design perspective because we kind of go through a traditional process of scoping and feasibility. What we like to do is take real engineering data, bring it up front and model these aspects, and look for those gaps in between things where we might say, hey, if we don't build here, we have carbon sequestration. And that's really important because that helps us from another aspect of resiliency down the line for climate change. So whenever we can combine and cross disciplines or cross asset types and look at those together, we find that there's probably more available opportunity there than there is when you go through a traditional process focusing on one asset or one aspect of a project.
Rick, when you sit in the public sector side and you've got responsibility for an asset that the public depends upon, and it's critical to the success for the livelihood, the safety of people, but also for the economy, how do you make that assessment in terms of, I think you gave an example of, the level of redundancy or the level of extra measure you put in place, so that it's somewhere between a fact-based decision and a gut decision, but you're making a decision in terms of the expenditure of dollars. So, and how do you do that as an organization?
Well, you don't sleep that well. So it's a big challenge, and you have to walk and chew gum at the same time. In the big picture, we just put out an 80-page road to net zero, so you're focused on not being part of the problem, part of the solution. At the same time, you're really trying to be sure that your assets are functioning. The SGR inspection process, it being rigorous. At the Port Authority, there's a minimum inspection somewhere between 1 and 3 years, depending upon the asset, and it's ranked, the inspector, the engineers, so that you wind up with assets being put in categories, and the people who are doing those inspections very, very sophisticated, and that's to some extent why we have we're folding in the resiliency analysis into the SGR process, because the point is to rank all these. You can't do everything, and you have to have some degree of confidence that you're identifying the worst risks, the problems, whether they're resiliency or whether they're the state of the asset itself. But you really have to be, you know, the issue in terms of your facility is multifaceted. So there's the basic resiliency, and is something going to fall down? There's also the way the facility is perceived. One of my pet peeves is elevators and escalators, because there's nothing that says more strongly to people who are using your facility that you're not paying attention and that the agency has low standards than coming across an escalator that's out of order, an elevator that's out of order, and there's not a repair person there. And so what we've done with lots of unlike modern elevators, escalators, in fact, it extends to jet engines, are there's remote sensors that are monitoring them. So to some extent, in terms of innovation, you're looking for technology assists to identify, and increasingly they do in terms of monitoring facilities, but remote monitoring, which tells you real time, is there a problem, and you can then respond to it quickly. And I think you have to be alert sort of across this continuum from what might be thought of as small things all the way to major risks. And I think innovation and technology really is a major tool to use.
You used elevators and escalators, which was the bane of my existence, and I was at the MTA because we didn't do such a good job. And I'll just tell you a little side story. I always do that.
It's still the bane of all of our existence.
So I'm much younger in my career, and I'm Senior Vice President of Operations at New York City Transit. We were having trouble with escalators, and the chair of my committee was an octogenarian. Somebody who'd been in the MTA family for a long time. And we were getting customer complaints about elevators and escalators. And there's a real long one at 53rd Street on the F in the eastern side of Manhattan, Fifth Avenue. And I basically poo-pooed the response. And he didn't do this in front of the public, but he said, you know, Tom, he says, when you get to my age, elevators and escalators, you view them a little bit differently than you do right now. He was right. He was right. Adam, I'm going to bring up a term that I think we've had a meeting up at NIPA, and I've talked about it before. But, you know, when you take a look at weather events, and whether it's in your area or not, you see the news media, and, you know, you take a look at what happened to Acapulco, and that was not a water event. That was a wind event. That was a Category 5 hurricane, well in excess of the lower minimum of that. But the storm that I'm becoming increasingly concerned with is called a derecho, and I don't know if you know what a derecho is, but it's instead of a hurricane wind event, it's a linear wind event. It could be as short as 10 or 20 miles. It could be as long as 100 miles. But it's an intense windstorm that lasts a little bit longer than a hurricane, moves in a direct line, and it causes an awful lot of damage. So when people think of resiliency, I think the most people think about is water, flooding, pumping, loss of facility, et cetera. But wind events can be just as troubling in different ways. And certainly with overhead transmission lines, or even on a railroad, if you got a lot of trees down, that gives you a problem. But are there issues that along those lines in terms of your distribution network that aren't water events but are wind events, and how do you address them?
No, absolutely, and I think, you know, one of the big opportunities we've been able to have with these significant transmission projects that are going to expand capacity from, say, a 115 kV line to a 345 kV line, is that we've been able to replace those structures that have been, you know, these assets are 80 to 100 years old, mostly wood assets that are, you know, some of them are in fragile condition. So the opportunity we're able to seize upon is being able to make not only the case from an environmental standpoint, also a financial standpoint. These projects actually save ratepayers money, but we're able to replace those with bigger steel structures, very strong wires, increased inspections with the technology using drones and other things, monitoring on a regular basis. putting sensors throughout the system. We put a communications backbone throughout our system, so we have sensors feeding into a centralized control area that gives us visibility throughout the system. So having that kind of visibility management, but the hardening of those assets has been a great opportunity for us to strengthen our grid, our backbone, and those wind events. There's not much we can do other than making sure that we're in the strongest position possible. And then, should an event actually happen, having the right response, having the right ability to mobilize and respond quickly. And in many cases, it's just not with NYPA itself. It's having relationships throughout the utility community because, we have a great system of what they call mutual aid. So, when one utility is hit in a particular area, it could have even been down in last few years ago was in Puerto Rico or some places in the state, the utility partners mobilized to assist that entity. And I think that mutual aid concept in and of itself is a resilient action that helps prepare and respond for these type of events, which are becoming more and more frequent.
One of the things I learned looking back when I was at the MTA was the level of engineering and the degree of attention they paid to detail. So the original subway construction contract one began in 1898. The system opened up in 1904, so that's 120 years ago. But the level of engineering was excellent based upon the parameters and the input they had at the time. But I learned over time that I was surprised. What's the famous phrase? You never cease to be surprised. You never cease to learn something new. So, once we got past Sandy and we started to look at things, New York Bay has risen 11 inches since the time the water level has risen 11 inches from the time the original subway was designed. So the parameters under which the original design were sound, but not necessarily going forward, either in a state of good repair or replacement or a hardening from a resiliency standpoint. How do you deal with that? What do you look at on the horizon in terms of the new standard? And certainly we moved away from, in some cases, 100-year storms. We looked at like 200-year storms because they're becoming more frequent. But how do you deal with that within an agency that has been dependent upon standards that were developed years ago, and you're trying to change, not a mindset, but just an approach? Rick?
Well, I think, you have to build in learning, which is things are changing. And so what's happened in terms of the standards that we're applying in terms of building, the standards that we're applying in terms of protective measures, and in terms of technology, Tom, you have to be adjusting and overbuilding measures and margins of safety. So you have to look at sea level rise. You have to assume what's more at the extreme end than at a conservative end. You have to look at storms. We've talked about they're being more frequent, they're more intense. Well, that means the storm surges are going to be more, so you have to assume a higher storm surge that you're protecting against. Then you have to build in a higher level of safety. So you're winding up over time building really very differently than in the past. The other thing that you're trying to do is recognize the technology is going to change. So whatever the safety factor that you're building in or the technology you're relying on, you actually want to build so that you can easily upgrade. Because the one thing you know for certain, which is today's technology is going to be outdated in a not hugely long period of time. So I think that has to be incorporated, and it's true of resiliency, it's true of technology, it's true of mode of transport. I would tell you the airports were not built for Ubers and Lyfts. They're built, and so you wound up with a change, which is a huge challenge from an infrastructure point of view. But you have to assume that that's what's going to happen and figure out as you design, as you operate, and in terms of what you're trying to anticipate, which is it's got to incorporate that sense of change.
There's a tough one, I think, for you, Adam, but maybe you've already thought about it at your agency. So, My whole career on the transit side was the whole diesel side, the whole bus side of the fleet was powered by diesel. So the worst exposure you had during the storm was getting the diesel fuel to the depot. But nowadays, as fleets become electrified, that's going to change, and it's going to be whatever the weakest link is in the distribution network to the depot. And is that something that you've got on the radar screen and you're addressing?
Yes, I mean, we are assisting in a number of different ways to the changes of technology in that area in terms of where we see EV vehicles going. So we have a number of different programs we're doing. One of them is called Evolve, and we're trying to fill the gap. We know that people will put chargers into their home if they have an electric vehicle. We know that commercial entities will put them in places along the thruway or where have you, where they feel it's commercially viable. But where are people going to put in chargers in more rural areas, which leads to what they call range anxiety. So some people today still have a reluctance to buy an electric vehicle because will it get me from my house in Long Island to drop my kid off in Binghamton, let's say? Will I make it all the way there? So what NYPA has been trying to do is fill in those gaps and put in DC fast chargers in areas where we feel that there is that gap, and to help animate that sector until it gets up and running and self-sufficient. And now, thank God, to the IRA and the different infrastructure acts, there are NEVI funds that are now available that will actually make it more doable for us to deploy these chargers throughout the system in a way that we can actually make it happen in a way that's not going to be draining resources from other priorities. So the leveraging of the federal dollars here will pay off in spades. Other projects we're doing for our customers, whether it's for the airports and putting chargers in at the airports and anticipating how not only were there not Ubers or Lyfts, but people are going to bring their electric vehicles to the airport and want them fully charged when they come back, is ensuring they have the charging network they need. And we're embarking on a program with the MTA. It's the first of one phase. It's about $400 million. We'll be building a charging network for their buses as they try to convert their buses to electric vehicle buses. And I think that's going to be a huge project and have huge benefits for the MTA and the residents throughout the city, because we know that some of the buses are the largest emitters of harmful emissions that were causing large asthma rates in certain pockets of the city. So this is something, if we can address that and attack it, it would be great. Another project we're looking at is in Hunts Point. They have a huge number of vehicles that are diesel refrigerated units. It stores a tremendous amount of food, and that is probably the largest contributor to asthma rates in the Bronx. And we're trying to and right now there's no other source of power to get there. So we're trying to figure out how we could use new technologies around hydrogen fuel cells and other innovative technology to replace those diesel trucks that are sitting in Hunts Point. So these are the kind of things that we're trying to take advantage of, the newer technology, to address some of these problems that you're identifying, Tom.
I think we're at a limit of time. I'd like to ask the audience there are times there are going to be challenges in the resiliency front. These agencies are going to be down to their last dollar. You sit in a position where you can help influence the dialogue. I'm just a firm believer in getting information up on the table so that society as a whole and agencies can make informed decisions. And where you can help that discussion because you're in a place where you work or you deal with issues where you can bring relevant input, please do so. Thank you very much.